So I want to start by thanking all of you for joining us today. My name is Alexis Doyle. I work for SaskPower as a consultant in our public engagement group here in Regina. I am joined by my two colleagues. I have Nathan Hofford, who is the manager of customer solutions, and I have Jenna Bedell, a consultant in our customer solutions group. And maybe before I keep going, would one of you be willing to give us a quick overview of the work that you do at Customer Solutions?
Yeah, I can do that for sure. So our team designs and delivers all of our essentially non-electricity sales type programs or solutions for our customers. So one of the things we do is we definitely stay connected to what's happening in the industry. We also look at what other solutions are being provided in other jurisdictions by other utilities. And we also stay connected to our customers to ensure that we understand what their expectations are from SaskPower. And then our team designs new solutions or programs for them. And then we also have an arm of our group that delivers those programs and administers them. So that's kind of a quick summary of what we do.
Okay, kind of keeping SaskPower on top of the trends and how the landscape's changing across utilities. That's great. Okay, so well, this is the third session in a 5-part webinar series about our power. If you joined us for the last webinars, our first session was focused on various sources of our power and some of the pressures that are driving us to change the way we generate power. And our second session that was delivered just last week was a conversation about how our power moves in our grid. So if you've joined us for some of the recent webinars in the series, you'll know that this is not your usual webinar. This is more of a conversation, and we really want you to be a part of it. So over this next hour, I will have the pleasure of serving you as the host. And in that role, I'll be asking both Nathan and Jenna to share their insights about what small scale power generation technology is and how it is evolving in this rapidly changing environment, and what that means for SaskPower and the residents and businesses in Saskatchewan. So along the way, I am going to be taking questions from our audience and feeding those to Nathan and Jenna. And we did have a question just before I jump in to our presentation. We did get a question if you can see past presentations, and we are just in the process of finalizing those, and they will be posted online. So thank you for asking that. Okay, so before we dive in, I just want to pause and acknowledge that the work we do here at SaskPower reaches the ancestral lands of many nations. And for Nathan, Jen, and myself, who are based here in Regina, we are going to be sharing our ideas and coming together in conversation today on Treaty 4, which is also the homeland of the Métis. A few housekeeping notes. Just to make sure that you can participate in today's conversation. If you're having any technical difficulties at all, if you look at the black bar that should be on the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a chat function. That's where we'd like you to post any issues you're having with technical difficulties. Some people are having technical difficulties in the lineup for the microwave, which is maybe why they were a little bit late today. Not quite the technical difficulty we were looking for, but if you're having problems with audio or some of the other issues with Zoom, we have a number of tech support on the line today to support you with that. And this is probably the most important piece, the Q&A. So as I mentioned, we want you to be a part of this conversation and asking us questions as well as the ones that I'll be asking Nathan and Jenna. So to do that, you want to click on the Q&A on the banner, the black banner. A pop-up box should appear, and that's where you can write your question and then make sure you submit. So I hope that's all fairly clear. Just a few housekeeping notes as well, or additional housekeeping notes, I should say. We are recording today's session, and to that question earlier, we are hoping to post it online on our engagement hub. And also, we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can, but if we can't get to all of them or if we don't have all the answers, we're also hoping to follow up with those after the session as well. So with that, I think that we can maybe start with a little bit of with some definitions or defining some terms. So Nathan, what do we mean when we say small scale technologies?
Thanks, Alexis. We're talking about distributed energy resources primarily, or DERs, if you will. So these can include generation technologies like solar panels, wind turbines, geothermal systems, combined heat and power systems, small natural gas or flare gas fueled generators, and other distributed generating technologies. But they also include electricity storage systems, things like electric vehicles, smart controllable loads such as heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, and electric water heaters. DERs, whether they use, generate, or store electricity, can be connected to the grid and integrated so that they're actually becoming a part of the local distribution system. And then they offer benefits to both the customers and to SaskPower. And of course, part of their value is that you can install them to solve specific challenges in specific locations on the system. And so when we say DERs, what we mean are technologies that aren't centrally located. Rather, they're distributed, as the name would suggest, throughout the power system.
Okay, so yeah, it's those smaller options. So it's not the natural gas generation plant or power plant or the coal power plant. Okay, so it's a great high level definition to get us all on the same page. So thank you for that. When I think about all of the technologies that can fit under that DER umbrella, the one that often comes to mind is solar. So maybe we can start there. How does solar fit under the DER definition? And maybe Jenna, do you want to try to answer that one?
Sure, yeah, I can jump in on that one. Well, it's interesting to see actually that our first question that's already come in before we even got into the content was about solar. So you were bang on that. That's the first thing that people think of when they think of small scale technologies. So like Nathan said, DERs include any small scale generation that produces electricity. By far, small rooftop or ground-mounted solar are the most common technology our customers are looking at for self-generation, mostly because it's the most affordable and the most accessible type of technology. And these customers may have different reasons why they want to generate their own power, whether that be for environmental reasons, economic reasons, or for energy and independence. And at SaskPower, we want to provide opportunities to allow those customers to participate in small scale generation.
Great. And I see from our chat that we do have some folks who are interested in learning a little bit more about the program, and we'll get to those questions in a minute. But how can customers participate today, say in the solar or those other types of power generation technology? Maybe Nathan, I'll throw it to you.
Well, right now that's through SaskPower's net metering program. And that allows for customers to install small scale generation technologies like solar, but also like some of those other ones I mentioned earlier. And you can install systems up to 100 kilowatts in size to power their homes or businesses. And the intent of that program is for customers to consume the power that's generated from those systems, but to still remain connected to the SaskPower grid so that they've got a reliable source of power whenever their own system isn't generating.
There is a question about payback for solar. I don't know if this is something that either of you are able to answer, but a question around why is there more than a 10-year payback for solar? Are either of you, able to shed some light there?
That's a difficult question. I think that's from Kathleen, right? Kathleen, can you give us some more context? Like, why is there more than a 10-year payback? I mean, I think that depends on how much power your system generates and what kind of, like, how much costs you're avoiding and what the size, like the cost of the system installed. Those are all the variables that determine what the payback for your solar system is.
Okay, so maybe Kathleen might be providing a little bit more in terms of insights to her question. Just to shift back to that net metering piece, which I know has a bit of criticism around it because there have been some changes that SaskPower has made to the rules a few years ago, if I recall. And so what's the latest on the net metering and what is SaskPower's intent with the program? Because sometimes I think we hear from customers that they think SaskPower should be doing more to encourage that small scale generation and especially solar. Nathan, to you.
Yeah, so SaskPower offers net metering, and because it recognizes that some customers are interested in generating their own electricity, right? So for some, the opportunity to participate in our province's energy transformation is important. And they embrace a notion sometimes called energy democracy, where they have more choices for how they get their power. So rather than relying on the utility exclusively, they can generate some of their own power or all of their own power. For these customers, DERs present a new opportunity to take on greater control over where and how their power is generated. However, our support for customers who self-generate can't come at the expense of those who don't want to self-generate. And so we have to make sure that self-generation doesn't create added costs for everybody else. We're seeking the appropriate balance. And from SaskPower's perspective, a couple of things to consider. So Saskatchewan has tremendous solar potential, but unlike most other jurisdictions, the time of day when solar generation systems provide power doesn't align with when Saskatchewan customers use the most power. That's winter evenings when the sun has already set. And so to serve that demand in real time means relying on other sources of generation to back up that solar generation. Additionally, achieving our greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets doesn't depend on net metering because there's more effective and more efficient technologies available to reduce emissions, like utility scale renewables. For example, utility scale wind generation is currently SaskPower's lowest cost source of generation. So with the net metering program, we're trying to find a balance between the interests of customers who choose to self-generate and SaskPower's obligation to serve customers who don't choose that path. And we have to make sure that what a few customers are doing doesn't become disruptive or more costly to the bigger picture.
Thank you for that overview. And somewhat related to the net metering, we do have a few folks who are joining us, as I mentioned, who might already be participating in the program. So someone who has a grid-tied small-scale solar panel installation, and they're wondering about end of life. So here with the net metering, you're talking about, well, it's an operation and some of the costing and payback for that. But I'm just wondering if on behalf of this one listener, they're just wondering about whether their installation contract honors the life of the system. So, because they recently were in Arizona and they saw that there were a lot of abandoned installations. I don't know if we can speak to that, or if either of you can speak to that or have knowledge on contracts.
I think maybe how I'd answer that one would be, as long as we have the net metering program and whatever the terms and conditions are around the program at that time, then there's still an ability for your system to be enrolled and part of that program. So, and in kind of the near term, we're still planning to have a net metering program. But like I said, it's just will be dependent on the terms and conditions at that time. Nathan, is there anything you'd add to that?
No, I think that's fair to say. I'm just trying to maybe understand the ask a little bit better. Yeah, like net metering's alive and well at SaskPower, and the terms and conditions of that program and all of those details are what SaskPower would honor, if I understand. I'm not familiar with
I think so.
what's happening in Arizona.
And maybe at the end of life, I think, of the project. So at the end of the, I think the question maybe is when the solar panel has reached end of life, in terms of like decommissioning, I guess, is that included in the contract? Maybe is potentially where that question's going, if I interpret it correctly.
I think maybe what they're meaning is that as long as their system's operating, will they be able to participate with a program at SaskPower? And I think the answer is yes. For the foreseeable future, we will have a program, but things change. And right now we have a net metering program, and then terms and conditions may change. So it would just be based on what those existing ones are.
Okay. Thinking back to last week's conversation about the grid, I know that there was a question that was asked, and maybe we can ask it here. Could distributed or private generation erode grid reliability over time? So if large industrial clients or customers or residential users, say, provide their own power, does that take revenue away from SaskPower for that critical maintenance and upgrades? How does that work?
Yeah, I can take that one. So I think, it's pretty apparent that SaskPower doesn't necessarily want customers to self-generate because we sell electricity, right? So we'd prefer if our customers bought their electricity from us. But we realize DERs provide customers with more options. So we need to be ready. But in that case, we need to still be ready to provide all the power to those customers when their systems aren't generating, like Nathan talked about. So that's where kind of the level of complication comes in. So it presents a challenge because those costs to deliver and maintain our infrastructure still remains fixed. It still remains the same, that we need to have that infrastructure going to your house to provide that backup power, even though those customers are purchasing less electricity from SaskPower. But like I already mentioned too, we can't ignore the customers that want to self-generate. So this is all still a work in progress. It's important to work with our customers to ensure their needs are met, so they're less likely to choose alternatives to SaskPower. It's also necessary, and we'll talk about it further along in our webinar today, that we have to make upgrades to our infrastructure. But not only our infrastructure, we have to also make upgrades and changes to our business processes, our internal policies, our cost models, and other things like that, so we can better accommodate DERs and their implications. For example, our existing cost model rely on what we call all-in pricing, which means SaskPower includes all of its costs into a single price per kilowatt hour. And that's fine if everyone is buying all their power from SaskPower, but it starts to not work so well when some customers start to self-generate, whether that be all or some of their power. So SaskPower doesn't really have a way to price that yet. So that's part of that whole, it's a work in progress. If customers self-generate and are still connected to the grid and depend on SaskPower when their systems aren't generating enough, then they no longer are paying SaskPower enough to cover the cost to provide them service, and then other customers have to absorb those costs. So we need to ensure we have the appropriate pricing and cost models to ensure all customers are paying their fair share for the services they use. And I did notice also, maybe I'll just jump in here, Alexis, I don't want to steal your role as the moderator here, but I did see a question coming in around kind of the difference of winter and summer generation and what that means for solar. And so like Nathan talked about, we're a winter peaking utility, but yes, definitely when our air conditioners are running and as we start to see our summers becoming hotter and more days of hot weather in a row, definitely solar is going to provide a solution for those summer days, and definitely is something we're looking at how that benefits our system. But it still doesn't take away that from December 21st, when it's the shortest day of the year and it's a really cold day, we still have to have enough generation and the infrastructure coming to your homes to still meet that peak demand on that day as well. So although there's value in the summer, we unfortunately aren't taking away from our short days and our cold days in the winter.
On that net metering, we had someone who was curious around what the uptake was for participation for that SaskPower's net metering program. Do we know what percentage of uptake there was, or do we have those that number at our fingertips?
I don't have it in front of me, but perhaps as we go here, I can dig for what our current uptake is.
Well, before you go digging too far, and just thinking back to Jenna's comment around that infrastructure upgrade piece, I know that in our conversations leading up to today, Nathan, that we talked a little bit about some of the difficulties SaskPower faces today with realizing some of the benefits of DERs, and you gave me a really great example, sort of like an analogy. Can you just maybe share that with the audience to help make sense of it all?
Right. So the challenge for SaskPower with DERs is that the technology available to customers today, that technology is smarter than our grid, if you will. And in the example that I shared was, it's like trying to connect your newest Bluetooth device to like an older model vehicle or car. So this fancy new device, it has all these cool features and capabilities, but we can't really utilize any of those cool features or capabilities because the car needs upgrades to its equipment before it's, quote, Bluetooth ready. And so SAS Power is unable to get the value that DERs can provide until we can modernize our distribution system and really take advantage of all of those features and functions that these new smart technologies can provide. So though reliable and safe, our distribution system is quite old and it relies on manual processes and devices mostly. So for example, when there's an outage or an equipment failure, we usually have to physically send out one of our field staff to locate that issue before we can begin making repairs. So we've come a long way over the past decade, but we've still got a long way to go before our system has the capabilities to really leverage DERs to everybody's benefit.
Yeah, it's that particular example resonated with me because I actually have a 94 truck that we had to upgrade in order to speak with the YouTube or with the Bluetooth. So I think that's why I liked it so much. So just want to switch gears a little bit because I think we could talk about solar and customer generation all day. And I know that we have a few more questions that we'll get to at the end on that, but I just want to make sure that we can keep rolling here a little bit more. I just want to switch it to another technology that you mentioned at the beginning around when you were defining small scale technology, and that's electricity storage. So what is it and why is it important?
Yeah, I can take that one. At the last webinar, if some of you folks went to that one, our panelists there, Raman and Andrew, talked about how electricity can't be stored on our lines and must be consumed in real time as it's generated. So SAS Power is constantly producing more or less power to match the level of demand from our customers across the province. The addition of electricity storage allows for the accumulation or storing of that generated electricity so that it can be used at a later time as needed, such as when demand increases or when grid outages occur. Also, because of the intermittency of renewables, meaning they're not always generating as they're dependent on the weather, storage solutions can help to balance the supply and demand of renewable generation. And I'm not going to get into the details of all the different types of electricity storage, but just want to point out that there are many different types of technologies, whether that be battery storage, thermal, mechanical, pumped hydro, and hydrogen.
Thinking about energy storage options and that there are many that, as you mentioned, there are many solutions and options that are categorized as battery storage. It does sound like it's a pretty nice solution for us. And I wonder, we have the solar programs and the net metering programs. I'm wondering whether or not we could encourage our customers to purchase electricity storage systems like batteries, especially for those who already have solar. Nathan, I wonder if, I've been asking you all the hard questions. I wonder if you want to field this one too.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept and certainly a good, something to consider. And so SAS Power is closely monitoring advances in electricity storage. And in the future, batteries could become a part of our net metering program, for example. Maybe you can envision customers charging their batteries in the day when their solar systems are going, and then SAS Power calling on them to deploy power to the grid when it's needed. But as I mentioned, SAS Power, we don't have the capabilities yet to be able to monitor and dispatch a customer's battery or other distributed technologies. So for now, though it's an interesting concept and something we're keeping our eye on, it's just not technically an option for us yet.
Okay, we don't have the system to support that just yet, it sounds like. And one of the last categories of small technology that you talked about in that definition was that concept of controllable loads. I think you mentioned heating, I think there's like ventilation and air conditioning systems that you talked about as well. Maybe I think you maybe even said like electric water heaters, but either way, like what is a controllable load?
I'll keep taking the easy ones here. So a controllable load is any non-essential electric load that can be deferred for a brief period of time and really with little or no effect on customer comfort or convenience. And it won't interrupt any essential operation at your business or your home. So like you mentioned, controllable loads are typically things within a home or a business like their water heaters, their air conditioners, electric heating, refrigeration, or pools and hot tubs that really can be dialed up or down and won't customers won't notice an impact to their environment.
So maybe before I ask you to explain how these controllable loads are defined as a DER, because when I think about the solar or solar as a DER and maybe the power it generates, and then I think about my water heater and how much power it uses, or I'm wondering whether or not you can just explain a little bit more. Why are controllable loads, why do they fall in that DER category?
Right. So we consider any smart device that's controllable and connected to our distribution system to be, potentially a DER, because if it's connected and it's controllable, it can form part of that local distribution system and provide value to the network. So going back to that idea of supply and demand, controllable loads provide an opportunity to adjust demand in addition to also adjusting supply, so that we have more options to efficiently find a balance between the two. So if you recall back to Raman and Andrew talking about, SAS Power is always trying to rebalance the system to perfectly align supply with customer demand. If we've got the ability to adjust some of that demand via controllable loads, it gives us options to be able to sort of adjust from both ends and maybe give us some more options to find that balance between the two. In the future, you can imagine we could have programs where customers could get incentives in exchange for letting SAS Power adjust their controllable loads, like turning down a smart water heater or an EV charger for a short period of time. And of course, if enough customers take part in programs like this, it could provide significant savings during periods when demand for power is high.
That's a really exciting and interesting concept. So I'm excited to have that realized at some point in time in the future. But just touching back on the technical difficulties and challenges that SAS Power has for connecting DERs on the system, we did have, I know we've touched upon a few of those, but maybe what's the suite of challenges, if either of you want to field that one? This was considered a softball from Dallas, I think. So Jenna, no, I just
yeah, well, I can take part of it.
Sure.
Definitely some of our technical challenges, like Nathan talked about, is just our infrastructure of not having that visibility and control in our system right now, and having that technology to be able to do it. And tied to that is, I've heard the term plug and play kind of a terminology, and I think the issue there is each DER needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis by our system planners to understand how it'll interact with our provincial grid. And that's both in kind of normal day-to-day operations, but then also in emergency conditions. So, as we, just to kind of expand on that a bit, if a tree falls on a power line, and, how do we know that a customer's solar facility has shut down as it should, and that it's not going to result in damage to our grid, but then also safety concerns for our customers and our field staff. So really it is kind of a case-by-case analysis that needs to be done, and studies done to understand what impact it'll have on the system, and then just our whole infrastructure challenges that we're working through. And I know we have some kind of more detailed content for later in the webinar too on that one too, so I won't kind of delve into that. Nathan, do you have anything else you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I would also just add that, just don't forget that when our system was built, when it was designed and built and installed, 50 or 60 years ago, I don't know what the timing on it was. It was built a certain way. It was built to take big power plants and then transmit and distribute that power out to customers kind of in one direction. Everything flows downhill, if you will, to the customers. And implementing, distributed generation, for example, starts to add power onto the grid, flowing in the potentially opposite direction at different points on our system. And sure, there's challenges there, but I think the point is our system isn't smart enough, so we don't have visibility on those smaller systems. And so we can't tell if those smaller systems are injecting power. We can't tell if they're injecting power and it's creating an issue. We can't tell if it's working smoothly and there's no issues. We don't have the intelligence on our system to be able to easily connect these distributed options.
When I think about some of the infrastructure required, and just thinking about smart meters, does smart meters play a role in allowing DERs to be available or realistic? And then if so, I know some of us have them, but we also have a question from the audience around when will they be rolled out to all of us, to most residents? So do smart meters play a role, and then when does everybody get them?
I'll chime in on that. I don't think I've got a complete answer on it because I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know our anticipated date for when smart meter rollout is complete, but it's in progress. The business customers have smart meters. We're starting to roll them out to residential customers, and there's a plan for those to eventually reach everyone. And those smart meters will contribute to the modernization of our grid. And so those smart meters provide us some visibility all the way to all those customer endpoints, the power flowing in and out of customers' homes. So they'll definitely contribute. I don't know if it's like a direct, you need a smart meter in order to be able to do EERs, but it's part of the bigger transformation of our distribution system.
Would it align or fit with that controllable load concept, Nathan, potentially, or does more need to happen at that residential level to support?
No, because the smart meters themselves wouldn't be the technology that actually controls those loads.
Okay. So maybe thinking back to the controllable loads overview you gave, and you talked a little bit about EV batteries. And so I'm glad you had mentioned them, because I know this is one of the techs that we haven't yet talked about, and another good example of a DER. Can you help me understand how EVs are considered a DER?
Right. EVs are a really interesting one. They're basically a smart battery on wheels, if you get really simplistic about it. So from a controllable load perspective, EVs and EV chargers have the technology to adjust charging based on signals from the grid. So again, in times of high demand and lower power supply, EVs or EV chargers could reduce their charging draw from the grid in exchange for compensation from SAS Power, for example. So in that sense, they can be a controllable load. But from a battery perspective, some EVs have the ability to discharge their batteries and actually push electricity back onto the grid, sometimes referred to as vehicle to grid or V2G. Now, those EVs could provide backup power to homes during outages, or simply provide power back to the grid when SAS Power is maybe short on power or could use an extra injection of electricity. So there's lots of promise with the notion of EV adoption in Saskatchewan.
That idea of power generation and compensation by SAS Power, we did have a question around what SAS Power buys back power generated. What rate does SAS Power buy back power generated from, say, solar? Is it 6 cents a kilowatt hour? Just to confirm for this listener, do we know?
It's 7.5 cents in our net metering program.
Okay, great. Okay, so this, again, another really exciting example of a DER. And Nathan, you talked a little bit about this a minute or two ago around the conversation Roman and Andrew were having around the history of power here in Saskatchewan. And they were talking about that idea that in early 1900s, power was generated and distributed in each municipality. And then SAS Power was formed, and all this infrastructure was essentially centralized into the generation in the grid that we have now today. And so they were essentially alluding to the fact that we might be moving back toward that decentralized model, which, as I continue to listen to both of you, feels like that might be where we're going with DERs, or at least a hybrid model of that. So I wonder, would either of you like to expand on that concept?
Yeah, I can handle this one. So advances in DERs are making these small scale technologies more cost effective than ever before, like we've talked about. So definitely we can see us moving towards maybe some more of that hybrid model, and a technology, and a good example of that is moving towards what the industry calls microgrids. So these are essentially what I'll call mini SAS Powers operating independently, or they could still be connected to the larger distribution grid. Many of our distribution lines serving remote communities, they're aging, requiring either upgrades or complete replacements. They're also costly to maintain as they run through forested areas, so thick vegetation, or across rugged terrain, so difficult to access. As an alternative, we're exploring this microgrid idea through a pilot that could see SaskPower install a solar battery and a backup diesel generator combo to supply the power to that small remote community. We think this microgrid option will be a more reliable option, have fewer emissions, and require a fraction of the cost to install and maintain. So we're very excited about this potential here. This technology could provide SaskPower with more options to serve our customers rather than just our typical building a line, no matter what the cost or effort to connect a customer in. So this hybrid model definitely holds promise to help everyone in terms of our power rates, our reliability, and also from an environmental consideration standpoint.
So the smart grid concept, I wonder if it answers this question that we did get from someone around why not work to a small scale distributed energy sort of sandbox where the intelligence is deployed on a small scale. Because based on what we're talking about and this person's understanding is that a smart grid could potentially take decades to achieve because it means, a revamp of the entire network. Is that what we're talking about here with the microgrids? Are we talking about a little bit of a sandbox concept?
I don't think so. And the thing I want to be clear about is we're not, as particularly in this microgrid pilot, we're not testing or trying to prove out whether the technology works. Like we know batteries work, we know solar works, we know a microgrid works, we know that technology can function, it's commercially available. What we're really testing out is the integration into SaskPower's system. We're testing out, can we control it and see it remotely? Can we see what's going on that microgrid from a centralized location somewhere else than where it's deployed? We're really trying to figure out how it integrates into a whole provincial power system, and that's the kind of thing we're trying to pilot.
Okay. So it's different essentially. And I know we've talked and touched upon a lot of the challenges or things that need to change here in order to accommodate and realize the benefits of DERs. And I think we've talked about a lot of it, but I just wondered, Jenna, is there anything that we missed about what needs to be done to enable the provincial grid to accommodate this small scale technology and potential microgrids here?
Yeah, well, it definitely is a multi-year effort to switch to that smart grid. And to put some scale to it, it includes upgrading 200 substations along our 3,500 feeders and all of the 550,000 customer sites we serve. So by about 2025, we'll be far enough along that we feel that this work will give us very good visibility into how the system is running in real time, as well as better control capabilities to start to manage the introduction of more DERs. But one thing I will say, it's not just as simple as the addition of new technology. So the new technology is going to change how we have to make decisions on how we plan and operate the grid. It also involves more work to define what our internal processes look like with how we have changed the work. Our processes, systems, policies, and structures, as well as the skill our staff needs to have in order to now operate and maintain our grid in a different way and plan our grid in a different way. So this change is a big effort and is going to take years to move forward. And like Nathan talked about, I think he mentioned, this is something that's been underway for years as well. And I think there's definitely things that our project team is looking at of how can we learn some capabilities in pockets around the province and then expand out. So I think we are taking a bit of that approach that I think that question was alluding to of, not just like wham bam, get the whole province and have to wait 20 years before it's perfect. We're taking that kind of pieced out approach, and like Nathan talked about, even with these pilots, how can we learn from those to then build those capabilities in-house over time, as opposed to waiting till everything's kind of figured out to launch it all.
So it sounds like it's a phased approach is what I hear you saying, right? It's not we're not going from 0 to 100, but rather incrementally moving toward that realization of DERs. Thinking about that idea of planning, you talked about policies and structures, and in some cases, DER technologies use natural gas. So can either of you speak to how SaskPower works with Sask Energy, or do we at all on joint energy planning? Is there any collaboration between both utilities?
I'll take a stab at that, but I think I don't quite know the answer. Like for Jenna and I in our group, we're working on our electrical distribution system. You know, that's
Okay.
the part that SaskPower provides service to its customers through. That's the part that we want to make sure maintains reliability. It's a great point. Certainly, as we think about like energy transition and what does that look like, and is there coordination that can happen? Maybe, probably, but at this point, I don't really have a good answer for that.
So when you were talking about that controllable load example, and we were saying like hot water heaters, you're imagining that hot water heater to be an electric hot water heater then, right?
Well, for SaskPower's purposes,
Right.
yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. That's helpful. Okay. Just thinking a little bit around, if someone is interested in small scale generation and adding storage or exploring microgrid options, can you share what they should do? Like, what's the next steps?
Right. Okay, if a customer is interested in, say, joining net metering, they can do that online. There's information on our website. That's a pretty straightforward process. But if you're looking to do something beyond or other than net metering, I'd encourage you to get in touch early. Conversation is key because we need to try to understand what your plans are and what your objectives are. So you can reach out to us at publicengagement@saskpower.com. We're designing DER policy, if you will, to reflect what we hear through forums just like this. And like I said earlier, this is an ongoing conversation. So I encourage you to please continue to take part and please continue to share your ideas and your thoughts about, how you think DERs could fit into the bigger picture in Saskatchewan.
And can you expand a little bit more, Nathan, on what we see, like what does SaskPower see the customer's role to be going forward? So they're getting in touch, they're reaching out, you're having conversations with them, but what do we expect of them?
We're in the early stages of planning how, all these emerging small scale technologies can be integrated with our system to provide value for everybody. That's what we're working towards, is value for everyone. So as the technology continues to evolve, we expect that more customers are going to be interested in installing more and different types of DER devices. Our goal, of course, is to make that easy for customers and also figure out how to leverage all of the value that those customer DERs can provide. So if customers are going to take it upon themselves to install these technologies on the distribution system, it seems like it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't figure out how we could leverage some value out of those. We'll continue to engage with customers to learn what's important to them as we explore any potential solutions. But like we said, this is a multi-year engagement process, so there will be lots of opportunity to get involved. I hope, as you can see from everything we talked about today, as new technologies evolve and become more affordable, there's more options than just rooftop solar, which I think you probably already knew. But it's important to understand that although SaskPower is evaluating all of these really interesting DER options, and that there's benefits that they can provide to the system, our highest priority is to ensure that we're making decisions that benefit everybody. And so SaskPower is likely to continue pursuing a measured and incremental approach to DERs. And we take the slower approach because it's important that we don't inadvertently create any negative impacts for some customers by trying to move too fast to accommodate the expectations of other customers. Like we've mentioned a couple of times, we're really trying to find a balance in all of this.
Right. And so as we see in the chat, we added our email address to get in touch. And so I know that we've answered a few questions as we've gone through today's conversation, and I'm just pulling up the Q&A now to see if there are some others that we might want to touch upon and see what else we can answer. There's a question around, you know, how about DERs that don't push power to the grid? Could that play a much greater role in energy service in Saskatchewan? And because I'm new to DERs and understanding what they are, what's an example of a DER that doesn't push power to the grid first? Like, can we answer that question?
I'll say like the controllable loads.
Okay. Okay.
Right? Those are
Okay.
like electricity users rather than electricity generators. And I think in a nutshell, it really comes down to our smart grid capabilities. So in
Okay.
order for us to leverage and get the value out of those devices, we have to have a grid that's intelligent enough to be able to kind of talk and communicate back and forth with those devices so that, you know, you can adjust load or you can get value or you can, you know, they've got to be integrated. And at this point, our system, like I said, it doesn't have those capabilities yet, but we're working on it.
Okay. So if controllable loads is an example of that, and the follow-up question was, you know, couldn't they play a greater role for energy service in Saskatchewan? And I'm just going to add to that comment. When I think about appliances in a house, and if those are used as controllable load, I think about how efficient appliances have become and continue to be. Is it realistic to see that play like a big part of the energy pie? Like those controllable loads are appliances in our house moving forward as a DER, or would that be like a small sliver in the pie chart? I'm just thinking forward. Any thoughts? Do we have any projections around what controllable loads could contribute in terms of overall energy?
Well, it's not like I said, they're not producing electricity, so they
Sorry, yes, okay.
contribute zero
Right,
to
right,
the total pie.
right.
However, as things like EVs and electrification and, you know, the demand for electricity grows, I think we certainly think there's opportunity for, you know, use a customer's home, for example, if it's loaded with a bunch of smart devices and those are all connected and integrated, there's certainly an opportunity for that household to reduce its, you know, the amount of electricity that's using and the amount of draw that it's requiring from the grid. And if we can have a whole bunch of houses and a whole bunch of customers with smart technology like that, the amount of electricity demand that we're trying to supply, it just gives more options. It gives more options to be able to do things rather than just building more, you know, building more power plants to generate more power.
I think I hear that often referred to. I'm just making up words. I'm making up words, but I often hear that termed as is it demand side management that we talk
Exactly.
about? Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Right. So you're kind of increase, or you're trying to decrease the load so that your threshold sort of remains the same by, yeah. Okay. Someone was just commenting on if there's a benefit to keeping things how it is, and the feeling that like that slow approach is probably more financially beneficial for SaskPower. Any comments to that?
Any benefits to keeping things how it is?
Just
You
from a
know,
financial perspective, right? Like thinking of that overhaul of the grid and what that could
I'm
cost. Yeah.
I might say I'm going to say not there's no benefits, but I just want to I'm going to maybe answer the question indirectly. You know, we mentioned all of that infrastructure that Saskatchewan has, you know, that we installed in the, I don't know what years it went in the 40s, 50s, 60s. A lot of those poles and wires, a lot of those assets, they're coming to their end of life. And so, you know, we've got to think about what's in the best interest of our customers. How can we most cost effectively, most reliably serve customers? And so if the option is, you know, rebuild some poles and wires to serve a community or a certain location, or if there's a different DER solution that we can provide that at a lower cost and higher reliability, better service, things like that, that's certainly something we want to be able to consider because there's benefits to everybody there. However, like we keep hammering home the point, our system isn't there yet to be able to pursue some of those options. And so as we modernize our distribution system, more of those distributed solutions will become realistic options. And if there's better reliability or reducing costs, whatever it is, I think those are things we want to pursue.
So if we're upgrading our infrastructure, and given what your team does, which is look at those forward trends, we're trying to incorporate some of those into those changes wherever we can, it sounds like. So, could we ever foresee a future where, back to those residential controllable loads, where they might be mandatory? Or would they just essentially always be voluntary? I know no one can predict the future. Is there a jurisdiction, like I'm just thinking about jurisdictions where they exist now? I know you're on top of the trends. Are you hearing about mandatory programs?
I would say no, but Nathan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, at this time it's all voluntary basis. And I think also even just how a lot of kind of those types of programs can work is that you would get a notification, say, to your smartphone from SaskPower saying SaskPower is, calling an event, asking for you to participate, and you can choose to select yes or no. So say if it's the middle of summer and you want your AC still cranked high because, you've got a baby sleeping or whatever, and you want to keep your house cool, you can choose to select no, even if you're participating in a program like that. So I think there's the thought, anyways, in my mind, is that this would continue to be something that's voluntary. I know there's sometimes rules around you must participate in X number of events, like if it's a larger size kind of demand response type program. But yeah, I think voluntary. I don't know, Nathan, do you disagree?
No, I definitely don't disagree. But I just think that's like a policy question. That's like the way that some of these solutions, the details around how they're deployed, and those certainly haven't been determined yet. I don't have a better answer than that.
Yeah, I don't know of any programs though in North America that are mandatory like that.
Okay. We're also getting some questions a little, I don't know if it's totally on topic, and that's okay. I think it's about that bigger picture planning, maybe of the infrastructure and other pieces of the puzzle around how we prioritize programs and projects here at SaskPower, and think about what's best for Saskatchewan. But there's some thought here around like building codes, and maybe that's tied to that controllable load piece. Do we know anything about changes to building codes or how that would fit in? I know it's a bit complicated, but it's okay if you don't have the answer, or maybe you do. Like, how do those pieces fit together, or do they?
Well, I'll start by saying, like, I think everybody knows, like, SaskPower is not in charge of the building codes. But I mean, we recognize they kind of go hand in hand. If you're trying to improve the efficiency and things like that, then there's certainly, building code standards that can help ensure that smart devices or efficient equipment or controllable, whatever it is, maybe is installed from the get-go, which could be advantageous. But again, we're not there yet because we don't have those capabilities on our distribution system yet. So we might be putting the cart before the horse, if you will, in saying, how can we require, controllable loads or smart devices or solar or batteries or whatever it is, when we know we don't have those capabilities to kind of leverage them just yet. But certainly an interesting thing to think about.
Right. I think it's what I've realized from this conversation and many others that we have here at SaskPower is that this is a really complex problem to solve, right? There are a lot of moving pieces, and to fit them all together, it takes time and lots of thought and planning to make it all work moving forward. I'm just keeping an eye on Tom. I know we only have 5 minutes left, and there's a few more questions that we could get to, but I just want to make sure that we wrap up on time. So I'm going to leave it there for now with the questions, and we'll try our best to answer those after today's session and follow up. I just want to share that, again, we are today is part of this 5-part series, and it sounds like based on today's conversation, there might be opportunity to even expand on that and add a few more, maybe on demand side management, for example. But we have some that are already on the books and in our calendars and coming up in November. And these ones are focused specifically on nuclear. So we have one that's going to talk a little bit about why we're thinking about nuclear here in Saskatchewan. That's on November 8th, again, during the lunch hour. And we're also going to take time at the end of November to talk a little bit more about how nuclear power works, because that can also be complex for many. So we're going to share a little bit more about that with a few guests that we're going to have a conversation with. And we also want to remind you that we have a few tools available online to keep you informed and engaged, including our engagement hub, sasspower.com/engage. And we also have a relatively new generation dashboard. I think it's just about a month old, but this might be of interest to many on tuning in today. But it is a up-to-date report on the amount of power that is being produced by generation option. So take a look at both of those. I think we've linked to both of them in the chat, so it's easily accessible to you all today. And on behalf of Nathan and Jenna, I'd like to thank you all for participating today, asking those really great and sometimes difficult questions or softballs, as Dallas pointed out. This is just the start of the conversation on DERs, as both Nathan and Jenna highlighted many times. But we appreciate your time today, and we hope to hear from you and see you again. The session's in November.